The transport from the Accord's orbital station to the Varath sovereignty's primary world took 3 hours, and Mael Dorn spent 2 of them reading documentation that was not going to be sufficient. This was not a new experience. 7 years of first contact documentation work had built in him the specific, patient relationship with insufficiency that was the documentation specialist's occupational condition. The understanding that the database was always partial, the cultural record always incomplete, the preparation always a map of terrain that the actual terrain would revise. He read the Varath sovereignty's cultural documentation with the comprehensive, pattern-finding attention of someone who was not reading for the information he would use, but for the information that would tell him what he didn't know, which was the more useful category. He was the documentation specialist. He was going to be at the hall's periphery with the recording equipment, documenting what happened to the people whose function it was to be in the depth. This was the arrangement of 11 first contact ceremonies across 7 years, and it was the arrangement Mael was comfortable with. Ambassador Karath delivered the briefing in the transport's remaining hour with the precise, economical quality of 22 years of significant diplomatic rooms. The briefing covered the ceremony's protocol sequence, the specific individuals whose attentions required management, the cultural sensitivities documented in the database, and the behavioral guidelines for delegation personnel in the Varath ceremonial context. The behavioral guidelines included: do not handle ceremonial objects. Mael noted this and returned to the cultural documentation. The Varath sovereignty's primary ceremonial hall was the kind of space that the cultural documentation had described accurately in its facts and inadequately in its quality. Ancient, layered, built in the sovereignty's 3rd century and modified continuously since. The walls composed of the Varath formal composite whose surface responded to ambient light in the specific, accumulated way of something that had been doing this for a very long time. The hall was significant the way that certain places were significant not because of what they were told they were, but because of what had happened in them. Mael stood at the designated periphery position with the documentation equipment and the cultivated stillness of someone present without participating, and he noted everything. Queen Sail Varath was 41 years old, ruling monarch for 18 years, and she entered with the quality of someone for whom the role and the person had become continuous rather than sequential. She moved through the hall with the specific inhabited quality of someone who was part of the space rather than occupying it. She had the Varath physical characteristic, the pointed ears, sharp and precise through dark hair dressed in the Varath ceremonial style. She wore the ceremonial crown with the settled quality of something in its accustomed place, as though the crown and the person had been in relationship long enough that the relationship was simply a quality of both. The ceremony proceeded through its first phase with precision. Then the second phase, the exchange of formal acknowledgments, began. Ambassador Karath stepped forward. The Queen stepped forward. Her foot found the irregularity in the floor. Mael documented it at the documentation attention's full precision. The irregularity was at the specific point where the original construction met the 3rd century renovation's addition. A slight, almost imperceptible unevenness visible only to someone paying the specific, comprehensive quality of documentation attention. The Queen's composure managed most of the disruption. Her recovery was approximately 1.5 seconds, complete and professional. The crown did not recover with the same speed. It fell. It landed on the ancient stone floor with the resonant sound that significant metal made on significant stone. Not loud, but heard by everyone in the hall with the complete, immediate attention that significant sounds in significant spaces produced. The hall went still. Mael was 12 meters from the crown's landing point. He was the closest person. He stepped forward and picked it up. He picked it up the way a person picked up anything that fell near them, the reflex of 32 years of existing in a world where objects that fell were picked up by the nearest person. His hand was on the crown before his attention had fully registered the movement, and the crown was in both his hands before the comprehensive documentation attention had processed the full significance of what he had done. He held it out toward the Queen. He looked at her. 263 Varath court members and officials and 7 Accord delegation members were looking at him. The Queen looked at the crown in his hands. She looked at him. She said something in the Varath formal language. The documentation equipment's translation system rendered it 4 seconds later on the screen he was not looking at. What she said was, "He has taken the crown." The court's response was the quality of a room in which the significant thing had been named rather than the quality of a room in which the significant thing had just occurred. The significant thing had occurred when he picked it up. The naming had occurred when she said he had. She reached out and took the crown from his hands, not placing it back on her head, holding it. Mail noted the distinction and filed it under. Significant, meaning unclear, requires follow-up documentation. He returned to the periphery. The ceremony continued. He found out what the picking up meant 11 minutes later. Coordinator Yeel, the Varath Sovereignty's senior court translator, found him in the reception suite and asked to speak with the documentation specialist. She looked at him with the quality of someone managing something outside the standard range. "When you picked up the crown," she said, "did you understand what the action meant in the Varath ceremonial tradition?" "No," he said. "The crown," she said, "is the physical representation of the ancient covenant between the monarch and the sovereignty, the covenant of the trial, the foundational ceremony of the Varath governance structure. When the ceremonial crown is dropped, and a person in the presence of the court picks it up, the ancient law interprets the action as a formal declaration of intent to undertake the trial. The declaration is binding. It is one of the covenant's foundational provisions, and it has not been successfully challenged in the sovereignty's recorded history." He looked at her. "The trial," she continued, "is a series of 7 tests designed for the specific physical and cognitive capabilities of the Varath ruling line. In 9 generations of documented instances, the trial has been undertaken 11 times. 7 candidates completed it, 4 did not. What happened to the 4, he said. The trial is designed for superhuman capabilities, she said carefully. The 4 who did not complete it encountered tests that exceeded their capabilities. They died, he said. Yes, she said. He looked at the ceiling of the reception suite. The Queen said he has taken the crown, he said. The acknowledgement is the covenant's ceremonial reflex, she said. 18 years of ceremonial training produced the response before the implications could be assessed. She did not intend to bind you to the trial. But the ancient law doesn't care about intention, he said. The ancient law, she said, is the ancient law. He was quiet for a moment. Can I review the documentation, he said. She blinked. The documentation. I documented the ceremony, he said. If the ancient law's application depends on the specific sequence of the declaration, the documentation is the accurate record. If the conditions weren't met exactly. They reviewed it together, 40 minutes of the comprehensive record against the ancient covenant's specific conditions. Crown fell, picked up, acknowledged, bound. The sequence was clean. The documentation confirms the binding, she said. Yes, he said. I know. I reviewed it anyway because the accurate picture is the foundation of any subsequent decision. He looked at her. How many tests? 7, she said. Word for word, he said. Before each one, the precise language of the ancient covenant, not a summary. She looked at him. The covenant's language is the standard briefing, she said. Word for word, he said. Yes, she said, with the quality of someone finding, in each additional request, a new dimension of what she was dealing with. He had 7 hours to prepare. He spent 3 of them in the cultural archive reading everything available on the trial's history and the ancient covenant's complete text, reading not for what the language said, but for what it didn't say, which was the documentation specialist's reading, the reading that found the gaps as significant as the language itself. He spent 2 hours managing the delegation's food supply with systematic precision. He spent the last 2 hours sleeping, with the documentation equipment's timer set for 58 minutes. He was as ready as 7 hours could make him. Shen Varath met him at the trial complex's entrance. 67 years old, 12 generations of this function in his family line, 30 years of personal experience. He looked at Mail, he looked at the documentation equipment. You brought the equipment, he said. I'm the documentation specialist, Mail said. It's the standard. The equipment will be damaged in some tests, Shen Varath said. The core recording function is rated for significant environmental stress, Mail said. You understand the trial's nature the tests are designed for. Superhuman capabilities, Mail said. Yes. I need you to give me the precise language of the covenant for each test before it starts. Word for word, not a summary. And I need you to tell me whether the language specifies the method or only the outcome. Shen Varath was quiet for a moment. The language specifies what the test requires, he said carefully. The historical instances have not typically distinguished between the method and the outcome. The historical instances were undertaken by beings whose capabilities made the intended method the natural method, Mail said. My capabilities are different. The distinction matters. Shen Varath looked at him with the 30-year function quality updating in real time. I see, he said, the ancient covenant's language for the test of physical threshold. The candidate must complete the physical course within the time period prescribed by the trial's administration protocol. Complete, physical course, time period. The covenant's language did not specify the method of completion. The first obstacle was a wall of a height that the Varath ruling line's physical capabilities made a standard climbing challenge. Mail walked along the wall's base until he found the specific, minor structural irregularity that centuries of settlement had produced. The slight gap, where the foundation met the floor. Sufficient for someone of his dimensions in a horizontal orientation with the documentation equipment's core unit held against the chest. He went through the gap. He emerged on the other side with the specific, deliberate quality of someone who had done an undignified thing, and who was not going to perform dignity about it, because dignity was a lower priority variable than completion. That is not the intended method, Shen Varath said. The rules specified completing the course, Mail said. They did not specify the climbing method. Shen Varath consulted the Covenant's language. Continue, he said. The notation was one line. The second obstacle was a suspended crossing, handholds spaced for the Varath arm span across a gap of significant depth. Mail removed the documentation equipment's carry strap, attached one end to the first handhold using its clip, used the strap's loop to bridge the gap to the second handhold, crossed, unclipped, attached to the second, and proceeded in this way across the entire crossing with the patient quality of someone applying available equipment to an available problem. He completed it within the time period. Shen Varath made a notation, 3 lines, the longest notation for a single obstacle in 30 years. The remaining obstacles of the first test produced variations of the same quality, Mail reading the Covenant's language for what was specified and what was not, finding the gap between what the language required and what the intended method assumed, and using the gap with whatever was available. He completed the test of physical threshold within the time period, sat down on the other side with the quality of someone acknowledging what the completion had cost, and said, "What's the second test?" "The rest period is." "I'm going to use all of it," Mail said. "I'm asking so I can think about it during the rest." "The test of cognitive endurance," Shen Varath said. "Good," Mail said. He was already eating. "I can do that one." The test of cognitive endurance required accurate decision-making, sustained across the test's duration. Decision problems presented at the pace of the Varath ruling line's cognitive processing speed, each building on the previous. The translation system in the documentation equipment added approximately 1.8 seconds to his processing time per problem. He managed it by front-loading, reading each problem's translation before the full problem was presented, beginning analysis before the official presentation was complete. It was not elegant. It was the documentation specialist's approach, systematic, pattern-finding, prioritizing accuracy over speed. He was slow. He was accurate. The Covenant's language specified accurate. It did not specify speed. He completed the test of cognitive endurance at 60% of the Varath administration standards pace. Shen Varath confirmed his accuracy rate afterward, 96%, the highest in 11 historical instances. The translation lag, Mail said, 1.8 seconds per problem forced the front-loading. Front-loading produced a second processing pass before committing to each decision. The second pass is where accuracy comes from. He paused. The test's design didn't include the translation lag. The lag was a liability that produced an asset. Shen Varath's notation for the second test was 11 lines. The third test, the fourth, and the fifth proceeded with the same quality. The navigational challenge, completed using the documentation equipment's mapping function, which identified the route indicators as electromagnetic variations in the architectural material. Variations that Varath sensory capabilities perceived naturally, and that documentation-grade scanning rendered visible regardless. The communication challenge, completed using the translation system's reference database and the equipment's transmission function, rated for interference environments. The fifth test's endurance component, completed with strategic deployment of a technical pause, the administration protocol included, during which Mail set the timer for 19 minutes and slept. After the fifth test, Shen Varath sat down across from him. This was the first time in 30 years of this function that Shen Varath had sat down across from a candidate between tests. "The trial has been undertaken 11 times, he said. "Yes," Mail said, without looking up from the documentation review. 7 successful completions. The candidates were individuals of exceptional capability. The historical records describe each of them with the specific language reserved for the genuinely remarkable. "Yes," Mail said. He looked up. "I read the records." "You are a documentation specialist," Shen Varath said. "Yes," Mail said, "who picked up a crown reflexively and is now here." He looked at the equipment screen. "The gap in the wall's foundation has been there 60 years. The wall's settlement produced it approximately 60 years ago," Shen Varath said. "Someone should tell the maintenance office," Mail said. Shen Varath looked at him. "The gap is not relevant to the trial's standard candidates," he said. "It's in the documentation now," Mail said. "Full record, useful reference for the next candidate who isn't Varath standard." He set the equipment down. "The 6th test, tell me the precise language." "The Ancient Covenant's language for the test of sustained endurance. The candidate must remain capable of deliberate action for the duration of 66 hours under the stress conditions prescribed by the trial's administration protocol, which conditions shall be applied in intervals of 4 hours of stress followed by 1 hour of cessation, repeated for the full duration. Capable of deliberate action, 66 hours, 4 hours of stress followed by 1 hour of cessation. The cessation interval," Mail said. "No activity is specified as prohibited during it." Shen Varath read the full language. He read it with the attention of someone reading familiar text with unfamiliar focus. "No," he said slowly. "The language specifies what must be maintained and the conditions applied. The cessation interval is defined by the absence of stress conditions. No activity is prohibited. So during the cessation intervals," Mail said, "I can sleep." Shen Varath was quiet. 1 hour of sleep per 4-hour cycle," Mail said. "The human sleep research literature, in the documentation equipment's medical database, I read it during the 2nd test's rest period, indicates that fragmented sleep across extended periods maintains cognitive function at approximately 60 to 70% of baseline. 60 to 70% is capable of deliberate action by any reasonable functional definition." He paused. "The Covenant's language was written for beings whose rest requirements are different from mine. The language doesn't prohibit sleeping during the cessation interval because those beings wouldn't use the interval for sleep. But the language doesn't prohibit it." Shen Varath looked at the Ancient Covenant's language for a long time. "The language does not prohibit it," he said. "I'm going to need the timer function," Mail said. "Yes," Shen Varath said, with the quality of someone making a determination that was significant and who was making it precisely. "I imagine you are." The notation for the 6th test's pre-administration discussion was 19 lines, the longest notation of a single test event in 30 years. He included a personal observation section, which the standard notation format had no designated space for and that he created because the standard format was insufficient. The test of sustained endurance lasted 66 hours. The stress conditions were real. Mail documented them with the honest quality of his function's standard. The documentation did not minimize what 66 hours of conditions designed for superhuman endurance applied to a human documentation specialist actually produced. Each 4-hour cycle was demanding. Each was not beyond capable of deliberate action because of the cessation intervals. He set the timer for 58 minutes at each cessation interval's beginning. 2 minutes to orient before the next stress cycle. 58 minutes of sleep, every interval. The sleep quality was the fragmented quality of sleeping in 58-minute segments under significant demand, which was not restorative in the full sense and was sufficient in the functional sense, which was the sense the Covenant's language required. Shen Varath watched from the observation position for 66 hours. His notations were, in aggregate, the longest documentation of a single trial test in 30 years, longer than several complete trial instances from his function's first decade. The notation quality was different from the standard administrative record. Something else had entered it, which was the quality of someone watching something for 66 hours and understanding. In the watching, something that the 30 years had been building toward without knowing it was building. At the 66th hour's conclusion, Mail was sitting with the documentation equipment in the alert, functional quality of someone capable of deliberate action. The margin was not large. It was sufficient. "The sixth test," Shen Varath said. "Complete," Mail said. "Yes," Shen Varath said. "The seventh test." "The test of recognition," Shen Varath said. "It is not documented outside the Covenant. Conducted in the presence of the court and the ruling monarch. The Covenant's language. The candidate must demonstrate, in the presence of the court and the ruling monarch, that they understand what the crown means." Mail was quiet for a moment. He looked at the documentation equipment, the 66 hours of record, the carry strap reattached in its standard configuration, the timer at its rest state. "The ceremonial hall," he said. "Yes," Shen Varath said. "The same hall where the crown fell." "All right," Mail said. "Let's go." The ceremonial hall had the same quality it had had at the ceremony's beginning. The composite material's surface response, the ancient stone, the accumulated significance of centuries. The court was assembled in the same arrangement. The queen was at the hall's center. She had the composed quality and the 18 years, and the quality of someone who had been present with the trial's progress for 7 days, and who was, in the ceremonial hall at the 7th test's beginning, in the position of a ruling monarch whose covenant had been carried by a documentation specialist she had not intended to bind. She had the crown in her hands, not on her head, in her hands, as she had held it since the ceremony. Mail walked to the hall's center, not the cultivated stillness of the periphery. The present quality of someone who had been in the trial center for 7 days and who was in the 7th test center now. He stood in front of her. She said, "The crown's meaning." He was quiet for a moment. He thought about the documentation, 7 days of comprehensive record, the carry strap and the timer and the gap and the translation lag and all of it, the full record of finding the way with what was available. "The crown fell," he said. "I picked it up because I was the nearest person and it had fallen. That is the accurate, complete description of the action." "Yes," she said. "The ancient law interpreted the action as a declaration. The declaration was binding, because the ancient law does not assess intention." "Yes," she said. "The trial is the Covenant's test of the declaration's candidate, 7 tests, designed for specific capabilities. The design assumed the candidate would have those capabilities because every previous candidate had." He paused. "The design and the Covenant are not the same thing. The design is the historical accident of 11 instances. The Covenant is the language." She looked at him. "The Covenant's language specifies what the tests require," he said. "Not the method. The method was assumed because the candidates had the capabilities that made the intended method the natural method. The design and the Covenant looked identical for 11 instances because the assumption was never tested. And in the 12th, she said, the assumption was tested, the carry strap, the timer, the gap in the wall's foundation. The translation lags front-loading, the 58-minute sleep cycles. The assumption was not the Covenant. The Covenant's language permitted what the assumption did not anticipate." The hall was quiet. "The equal," he said. "The crown's meaning in the Covenant. The foundational ceremony of the sovereignty's governance structure. The test of the monarch's equal. The equal is defined by the trial. But the trial's definition is not capability. If capability were the definition, the Covenant would specify capability standards. It doesn't. It specifies completion of specific requirements with the method left to the candidate." He looked at her steadily. "The Covenant leaves the method to the candidate because the method is the test." She was very still. "The 4 candidates who didn't complete the trial had significantly more capability than I do," he said. "The military commander, exceptional by the sovereignty's standard. He didn't complete the 6th test because the capability was always the method. When the capability was insufficient, there was no other method." "No," she said. "I did not have the capability," he said. "I had the carry strap and the timer and 7 years of reading precise language for what it says and what it doesn't say. And the Covenant's language for 7 tests said what must be achieved and not how." He looked at her. "The crown's meaning is the Covenant, and the Covenant's meaning is, the equal is not the one who has the same capabilities as the monarch. The equal is the one who finds the way." The hall held the silence of the significant thing, said in the significant space. 263 people who had been present for 7 days of something, and who were receiving the thing the 7 days had been building toward. The queen looked at him. She held out the crown. Not the formal placement, not the covenant ceremony of the trial's completion, which had a specific form that Shen Varath had been prepared to administer. She held it out in the specific, personal quality of a choice rather than a ceremony. The person, not the position, the underneath quality fully present. The trial is complete, she said. The covenant's requirements are met. She paused. What I am doing now is not the covenant's ceremony. The covenant's ceremony I will complete with Shen Varath in the appropriate form. What I am doing now is the person, not the position. She looked at him with the full quality. You picked it up reflexively. I said he has taken it because 18 years of ceremonial training said the words before I could consider them. Neither of us intended what the ancient law made of our actions. No, he said. But here we are, she said. Here we are, he said. 7 days, she said. I have been watching the trial's administration record, the carry strap, the timer, Shen Varath's notations. She paused. In 3 previous administrations, the carrying of the Covenant's test was visible in the doing of it, the capability meeting the design's intention directly. In 7 days of watching the carry strap and the timer and the notation lengths, the quality was different. What quality? He said. Watching someone find the way, she said. Not demonstrate capability, find the way. The carry strap was the first time in 3 administrations that I saw someone look at the problem and look at what they had and find the connection. The military commander didn't need to find the connection. The connection was built into the capability. The connection was the test, he said. Yes, she said, and the capability made it invisible. He looked at the crown, he looked at her. The record, he said. If I take the crown, the full record goes to the official archive. She looked at him. What record? The complete documentation, he said. The carry strap, the timer, the gap in the wall's foundation, the notation lengths. Shen Varath's personal observation section. He looked at her. The next candidate who isn't Varath standard needs to know the method is available. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she had the expression, the full, unmanaged quality of someone who has been in significant rooms for 18 years, and who is, in the ceremonial hall at the end of 7 days, in the most significant room she has been in. The record will be complete, she said. Every detail, all of it. He reached out. He took the crown. He held it in both hands with the careful quality of someone holding something very old and very significant that was, in his hands, both of those things, and also the weight of a choice made in the presence of 263 people. Shen Varath, he said. He should be named in the record specifically, 30 years of this function and this instance. He will be named, she said. And the gap in the wall's foundation, he said. The maintenance office. The maintenance office, she said, with the something underneath quality fully present, will receive the documentation. He looked at the crown, he looked at her. The larger conversation, he said. The one that's not the covenant and not the trial. Yes, she said. That requires more than 7 days, he said. Yes, she said, considerably more. The person, he said, not the position. Yes, she said. He looked at the crown and the hall and the court, and the space that had contained significant things for a very long time, and that was, at the end of 7 days, containing the most specific and personal significant thing it had contained in all that time. The documentation, he said. I'm going to need to document the larger conversation too. She looked at him. Standard practice, he said. The documentation specialist documents what happens. She looked at him for a long moment with the full, unmanaged quality, the person completely, without the position's management over it. Yes, she said. Document it. Thoroughly, he said. Thoroughly, she said. Outside the ceremonial hall, the Varath sovereignty continued its operations. The record was going to be complete. The carry strap, and the timer and the wall's gap, and the 58-minute sleep cycles, and the notation lengths, and Shen Varath's personal observation section, and the crown held out in the personal quality and the documentation specialist who had taken it. All of it, the documentation, was the beginning. And the beginning was, as it had always been, in every significant room that had ever had a documentation specialist standing at its periphery, where the actual record started. He had been the nearest person. He had picked it up. That was the beginning. What came after was everything the documentation would need to contain.